All right. So, good afternoon. Today is we're into our second last week. It's Monday, and that means that we have Professor Takahashi coming, which is we're very lucky to have. And he's coming from Tokyo, and I'm very pleased to have him. And then, Saul, if you don't mind, I'd like you to do a self introduction just before you go in. And I forgot to check.
Sure.
You can screen share, I think, from your side. If you can't, just let me know, and I'll let you do that.
I guess I should be able to. It has the button on the bottom of the thing, the screen. So I'm pretty sure it should work. If it doesn't work, then you can just make me a co-host. So I
Great.
guess fine. But yeah, okay, so great. No, it's thanks very much for giving me this opportunity. It's wonderful to be here. Be here. I mean, my house in Tokyo. Obviously, I'm just joining online, but it's great to have this opportunity, and I really, I think it's really important what's going on. This kind of synergy and this kind of connection between Japan and Burundi and people all over the place is really very, very important. So right now I'm from 2009 to 2019. I've been teaching at Osaka Jogakuin University together with Richard. I'm the professor of human rights and peace studies, so I do a lot of teaching, mainly of human rights. I'm a human rights lawyer. I have a pretty long career, which is just a fancy way of saying I'm older than a lot of the people listening to this seminar. And I started off working for Amnesty International in Japan, and then I went on to Amnesty International in London, where the headquarters is. Then I moved on to the UN, and I did all sorts of different positions there. From 2009 to 2014, I was the deputy of the Office of the UN Human Rights Agency in occupied Palestine. So that was a very intense experience, of course, 5 years in occupied Palestine and seeing investigating all the human rights situation there. And I do a lot of talking about Palestine, and that's certainly one of the things I continue to do research on. But today I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about business and human rights, which is something that I was involved in very closely after I left the UN in 2014 and came back to Japan. So from 2014 to 2019, when I started at Osaka Jogakuin, I was the Japan representative of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, which is an international NGO. It's based in London, but we had, I think at the time it was 14, now I think it's more like 18 local representatives in all countries all over the world. And I'll talk a little bit more about this NGO and what it does and the kind of work that it involved a little bit later on. But maybe right now what I can do is I will try to do this thing. Yes, it looks fine. So sharing the screen looks cool. All right, great. And I will, how do I do this again? I do a screen show, or rather a slideshow. Right, okay. So I hope you can all see the slides now. Yeah, like I just mentioned, I was involved in the business and human rights area from 2014 to 2019. So really almost 5 years there as well. I was the Japan representative of this international NGO and worked mainly with Japanese companies trying to get them to respect human rights, not only in their operations in Japan, but also abroad as well. And that included also work on a couple of African countries in a few different instances. But really, the business and human rights areas, it's a new and exciting field in human rights in general. And it's something which, of course, a lot of people are very interested in, and a lot of young people are gravitating towards, because it gives a really good opportunity to look at how businesses and the private sector can respect human rights, and what is it exactly that they've got to do? What kind of responsibilities do they have when we say business and human rights? So I'll just get straight into it. First of all, before I talk about what human rights and business and human rights is, I want to talk a little bit about what it's not. Because a lot of people hear business and human rights, and they have all sorts of different ideas about what it's what it really entails, what it entails. So first is CSR, which is corporate social responsibility. Those of you listening to this who are interested in going into the corporate sector probably already know this, corporate social responsibility. And so a lot of people say, oh yeah, business and human rights. So that's about like CSR, right? And in broad terms, of course, corporate social responsibility does include human rights, or it should. But the thing about CSR is that there's really no clear definition what it means. This term CSR is bandied about all the time, and companies are always saying, oh, CSR this and CSR that, but nobody really knows what exactly they're supposed to do when they say CSR. What most people think of when they think of CSR in the corporate sectors, they think of doing good things. So like donations to NGOs. A lot of companies in Japan have special dispensation for staff who, for example, they want to volunteer in an NGO abroad for 6 months, that they allow them to do that and keep their job. So that's the kind of thing that you see in a lot of CSR reports of big transnational companies, especially including in Japan. But so that's what most people think of when they think of CSR. But again, like, it's very unclear what exactly CSR is and what exactly a company is supposed to do. The other thing about CSR is that it's the first thing that gets dropped. When a company is not doing well in terms of business, when it's not making enough money, it tends to be the first thing that gets dropped. And we've seen that again and again. A similar concept to CSR is the SDGs, and I think a lot of you already, you know about this, you've heard about this, and probably a few of the other lecturers have already touched on this in the seminar this summer. The Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. So, you've heard about the SDGs. I'm sure all of you have seen that poster and seen these pictures of the SDGs, and you've seen big transnationals talk about, brag about how they are very mindful of the SDGs and how they do a lot of work for the SDGs. Now, I have a personal beef with the SDGs, and one of the first one is that, just like CSR, if you think CSR is vague, the SDGs are even more vague in many ways, and they allow almost anything. I have had, there's one SDG that talks about the right to housing, or adequate housing, and that how everybody should have adequate housing in the world. And I've been, I was at a workshop with one Japanese big real estate developer, and he was saying, oh yeah, but you see, we make houses, so we're working towards this SDG. And my answer to that, of course, was, yeah, you're making houses and you sell them, and you're making very expensive houses and you're selling them to rich people who can afford them. What does that have to do with the SDGs? But my point is, the SDGs are almost so broad and so vague. I wouldn't say that they necessarily allow this, but a lot of companies they try to squeeze SDG compliance into their normal business model, which is not what it's supposed to be. The other thing about SDGs is that they are aspirations, they're goals, like they're called. They're just goals. So they're not obligations, they're not legal obligations, they're not something that you really have to do. Same with CSR. Like I said, the first inkling that business is not good, then we see CSR being dropped. And it's the same with the SDGs. They're not obligations. They're not obligations for countries, and they certainly are not obligations for companies. The other thing I would say about the SDGs is that they're not comprehensive. They do appear the way that they have been, there are sort of like commentaries written on them. And the way that they are interpreted, they do include some very important human rights, but they don't include all. And so, they're just not comprehensive. They're not quite as good enough, in my mind. One final thing that I want to talk about is diversity, which a lot of companies in Japan and elsewhere as well have been talking about for a long time. And diversity, diversity in the workforce. We have all sorts of people of all sorts of creeds and races and religions and nationalities and sexual minorities and all that kind of thing on our workforce. And a lot of companies make a really big deal of their efforts in diversity. And again, like with CSR, and to a lesser extent, I guess, SDGs, there's nothing wrong with diversity. I mean, diversity is fine. I think it is really important, and to really have really have respect for human rights, arguably diversity is a step on the way. It's pretty important. You can have respect for human rights without diversity. It's presumably possible, but it's pretty darn difficult to do. So it is important, but diversity is just a step on the way. That in itself doesn't necessarily mean that all human rights are respected. So again, it's important to have the distinction between, all of these. So when I'm talking about human rights, we're talking about a clear legal framework, right? International human rights law, international labor standards. Now, usually I would talk about business and human rights. I would go through all of these international legal treaties and what exactly human rights includes and all that kind of thing. Of course, we don't have the time here to do that. But the main point is that when we're talking about human rights, there's a clear body of international law. It's law. It's a legal thing. It's not something that you kind of do when you kind of feel like it, and you do when you have enough money, when business is good. No, it's something you have to do. It has nothing to do with how much money you're making or whether things are good. You have to do it. It's a legal obligation. That's one of the big differences. The other thing is that we have this whole whole structure in the UN and internationally interpreting these provisions of human rights. So there's a relatively clear idea as to what they require and what it is that people have to do. So again, that's different from CSR, SDGs, vague. We don't really know what it means, but we want to sort of look like we're doing the right thing. No, we have human rights provisions, legal provisions that have been interpreted in courts and quasi-judicial committees in the UN, all this kind of stuff. So, it's much more clear what exactly it means to respect human rights. Yeah. So, these are really some of the main differences between human rights. What really distinguishes human rights from all these other vague things that companies often like to talk about. So international law is, it is about states, and I don't know how many people listening today have taken courses in international law, but states really are the subject of international law. So how is it that we got started to talk about businesses and how they should respect human rights? Well, there's a sort of long history for this, and then, I don't want to go, we don't really have time to go through it completely. I think the most important thing that people should take away from this is after the Cold War ended in 1989, especially around then, was really when international companies, transnational companies started gaining really immense power, right? And the immense power that they wielded, people started to recognize were akin to that of states. They had power not only over the people that worked for them, but the people that worked in their suppliers, their families. When you look at, large scale energy companies, and I put a few Shell, BP, those kind of companies, they would have these gigantic development projects in geographical areas. They would be like, they would rule that area of the country. They had security companies working for them as private armies. They were in essence a state within a state. So, people started realizing, hey, these companies are getting bigger and bigger. They're getting richer and richer. Some of them have, budgets that dwarf countries in a lot of regions. So, the power that these companies wield over the lives of people started recognizing that, look, this was something that we really need to look at human rights. We really need to look at the human rights record of companies, and try to make sure that they do a better job in respecting human rights. Some of these companies that I've listed here, they were the subject of quite serious scandals in the late 80s, early 90s about their treatment of employees in particular, and also people that were residents of areas where they were doing large-scale development projects. So Nike was, there was a huge string of scandals about the treatment of Nike, of people making Nike sneakers, and this was mainly in Southeast Asia, actually. BP, Shell, Shell, of course, was like the king of the mountain in some areas of Nigeria. and the gross human rights violations that took place against their workers and by security companies, all this kind of thing. This was these were huge scandals, and this really moved the needle in many ways in many countries towards saying, okay, look, we've really got to think of how we can regulate international companies, transnational, gigantic companies, because the power that they wield is so great. And yeah, and one of the key factors also behind this, the fact that in the late 1989 the Cold War ended, and transnational companies started wielding, gaining so much power. One of the factors also behind this was this whole international supply chain. And I know that those of you who have like taken business courses, and I'm sure many of you know about this kind of thing. The whole idea is, if we just think of, for example, I mean, the normal example is usually apparel, so clothing. So if we think H&M, which is of course a big Swedish brand, H&M doesn't make anything. I mean, they don't have, I don't know for a fact that they don't own any factories, but this is just an example. It's an indicative example. These kind of gigantic apparel brands like H&M or Levi's or Uniqlo in Japan, they don't make anything. They don't own any factories. They don't have any workers toiling away making their shirts, right? If you look at, I made this sort of pyramid type shape for the international supply chain. If you look at the third tier suppliers, and even to make a shirt, I mean, there are more tiers than just 3. I mean, you're looking at 5 or 6 or whatever. But just for the sake of simplification, I made it like this. So the third tier supplier, they're the people who would, like, for example, pick the cotton. So they have cotton fields. We're looking at places like Uzbekistan, where people are actually forced to pick cotton by the government. Egypt, all sorts of different places where they produce cotton. So these people, the third tier suppliers are the ones that they make. They grow cotton and they pick it. These are not H&M staff. They're not H&M employees. They're their own company, or maybe they're just family run, whatever. But they're a completely separate entity. They pick cotton and they sell the cotton to the second tier supplier. Yeah, the third tier supplier, quite often, they don't even know that the cotton is eventually going to become an H&M shirt. They have no idea. They just pick the cotton, they sell the cotton to the second tier supplier, and that's the end of the picture for them. Now, the second tier supplier, they might make it into a shirt, right? And they make it, they cut everything, they design it, they don't design it, but they make it into a shirt and it looks more like a shirt. Now, they sell that to the first tier supplier. The first tier supplier fools around with the color a little bit. They put on the H&M price tag and then H&M label, and it's a done product. And then they sell that to H&M, the international brand. That's essentially how it works. So you have this, hundreds of big companies have thousands of suppliers in their gigantic supply chain. And it's really usually they only have contracts with the first tier suppliers. The first tier suppliers are the ones that produce the shirts. The suppliers behind the first tier, the second tier, the third tier, the fourth, H&M has no idea. They have no idea whom the first tier supplier is contracting with. They have no idea whom they're doing business with. They don't know, and they don't care. H&M, all they know, I'm talking really bad, like I'm talking bad about H&M, this is just an indicative example, but the only thing that H&M knows is that, they have a contract with the first tier supplier to produce these shirts, right? So quite often what you see is horrendous labor violations in the first tier, the second tier, the third tier. It goes on and on. Sweatshop type forced labor, child labor, all these kind of labor violations that you see this throughout the supply chain. And when, for example, this is how Nike tried to deal with the scandal at first, like a journalist or an NGO will find out about the labor violations in the second tier supplier, right? So they go to H&M and say, well, these suppliers of your shirts are doing these horrendous violations. H&M says, yeah, but We have no idea. We've never heard of this company. They're a separate company. We don't have a contractual relationship with them. We don't know who they are. We don't. This is not our problem. All we know is that we buy shirts from somebody. That's all we know. And even in the first tier supplier, if there are human rights violations, that's not really our business. We're just a business. We're out to make money, and we just buy products from people. And how they produce them and how their suppliers produce them, that's not our problem. If you have a problem with the second tier supplier, why don't you go to the second tier supplier? Right? That's how it. That's the whole idea of the international supply chain. It makes the products cheaper and cheaper, because the international brand can use their negotiating power to create, to get the price down and down. And that means cheaper products for people who can afford them. But it also means that it also encourages these kind of labor violations, and it encourages the international brand to try to wash their hands of any kind of responsibility. They don't know. So for a long time, this was sort of like the battleground with citizenry who were saying, look, businesses, international brands have to be responsible. And the international brands saying, yeah, but we have no idea. We're not mistreating people. If other companies are mistreating people, you should criticize them. It's not our problem. So there was this kind of battleground, and the supply chain was being used as a way to shirk responsibility. Right? And these are just, some images of the labor violations that take place in the supply chain. It's important to understand that the rights violations that take place in the supply chain, we think of sweatshops. I was talking about apparel, and Nike, of course, makes shoes. So people, think of the kind of sweatshops that we think of on the top left photograph. But in fact, there are labor rights violations everywhere, and there are more labor rights violations actually in agriculture. So, modern slavery is alive and well, I can tell you, and child labor, and all these kind of things. And the role of labor unions is always very key, because where we see a lot of the countries in the second tier suppliers, third tier suppliers, fourth tier suppliers, on and on, we see a lot of countries that have rolled back protection for labor unions. So labor unions can't exist, independent unions, or even if they do exist, there are a lot of restrictions. They can't be vocal in their opposition. We see this again and again. And that is part of this whole perpetual cycle of how labor rights are affected by, whether trade unions can really perform an effective role or not. And one of the typical examples, of course, is Rana Plaza. And this is something that took place in 2012, I think it was, where there was a factory in Bangladesh that was supplying all these Western brands. Like H&M was actually one of them. H&M, C&A, all these kind of very well-known. Zara was also one of them. And they were supplying, supplying shirts and trousers and all these kind of things. Now, in Bangladesh, there was no independent unions were not allowed. There was like one government-approved union, and as you can imagine, they were basically in the pocket of the rich and powerful. So they couldn't perform a vocal role. So what happened is you had this 3-story building, and the owner of it was so greedy, he wanted to cram in more sweatshops, that he illegally built 2 extra stories. And this is a long story. We don't really have time to go into the details, but the workers were locked in during their shifts for like 10 hours. I don't think they could even go to the toilet. And they're watching, the roof or the ceiling start to crack, but there's no labor union. There's nobody to complain to. If 1 or 2 workers complain, they're just fired. I mean, they're given the boot. And so what eventually happened, of course, is this collapsed, and there were over 1,100 deaths and the whole thing. So this was, quite a scandal, and it was very well picked up in the international media and all this. There's a lot of pressure on international brands and also the Bangladeshi government to really clean up their act. Another example of how business activity can affect human rights is one of conflict minerals. If you think of your smartphone, and we use the examples of smartphones because everybody's got them, not just smartphones, I mean mobile phones, but because everybody's got them. But it's the same also with computers, with aircon, basically any kind of electrical appliance or good has a lot of these kind of minerals. And the three T's and G are the ones that are most often pointed to. And you can't make anything electronic without these minerals. It's just not possible. So a lot of these minerals come from the DRC, and as you can, the way that big companies are sourcing their minerals basically is adding fuel to the conflict. So you have these armed groups which start fighting over mountain areas where you can get these minerals, and the armed group that rules a particular mountain, basically they're the ones that get the minerals, they mine the minerals, and they sell them to companies and on the way to international brands. In all fairness to the international brands like Apple or Samsung, they don't actually go to the DRC and source from them. They're sort of middlemen, which are often very much the problem as well. But the point remains the same. I mean, all of our phones, all of our computer gizmos use minerals that are being taken in a way that fuels the conflict in DRC. And so this is, I mean, there are a number of different sort of numbers that you see about how much money this has contributed to armed groups in DRC. Nobody really knows, but the point is very clear that it's taking place, and that the money that is coming from all these gizmos that we buy are really going into the pockets indirectly, but they're going into the pockets a lot of people who want to keep the conflict going. So, this is all very serious, and all of these really serious violations are taking place really through business activities. And that's why, people started recognizing that transnational companies should be called to account, that they should be called upon to really respect human rights in a way much more effective than they had been. And these are, besides conflict minerals, these are just some of the human rights issues in mining in general. Of course, I think, these are all pretty clear stuff of land grab and the rights of indigenous persons. And this is taking place, of course, in many places in Africa, Latin America. The photograph, the bottom is from PNG, Papua New Guinea, all these kind of terrible things that take place with energy development in general and mining in particular. So I'm going to hear. So as, there were more and more calls on companies to really respect human rights in a more sound way, the way that companies started dealing with this kind of issue has evolved. And at the very beginning, companies said, well, we pursue profit. And I've had some Japanese companies, not big ones, but still, I still have Japanese businessmen, tell me that, oh, well, through business activities, we're actually creating jobs and creating wealth. So that's enough in terms of fulfilling our social responsibility. So this guy really, those people are still sort of living in the 80s, I'm afraid. But the bulk of the mainstream of international business has gone beyond that. And then after that, people started talking about compliance. And I think probably people have heard of this expression in the business sense. It's when lawyers get together and talk about whether businesses are following the rules, whether they're following the laws of where they're operating. And compliance is important. I'm not saying it's not, but compliance is just about making sure you abide by the laws of your own country. And if you're in a country, so we think about Rana Plaza, where independent unions, Bangladesh, where independent unions were not allowed, any foreign company that is operating in Bangladesh, they don't allow independent unions, and their lawyers are going to say, yeah, that's fine. You're operating in Bangladesh. That's just how it is. So, that's from the human rights perspective, that's not good enough, because we want to see countries adopt laws that are really, in line with international standards. So when companies go and they say, yeah, well, this country makes things easy for us, because they don't allow trade unions, that's not what we want to see. So the whole compliance debate lasted for a few years, but people realized, look, this just ain't good enough. And then came CSR, which, as I noted, was very vague. And now, really, where businesses is there finally talking about international human rights and how important it is. And the real, uh, precursor for this was the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. We call it the UNGPs, or the Ruggie Principles. These were adopted by the Human Rights Council of the UN in 2011, right? So that's when really the UN, the international community, adopted a body of principles of what businesses should do, how they should respect human rights. Now, I have a picture of this guy down in the bottom here. This is Ruggie. This is John Ruggie. I think he's still teaching at Harvard, and he's the one who drafted the Ruggie Principles. That's why they're named after him. But he was requested by the UN Secretary General to do this because various different efforts hadn't borne fruit, and he spent 6 long years, really traveling the globe. Speaking with human rights NGOs, of course, but also speaking with, actual victims of human rights violations in groups of indigenous peoples, people affected by human rights, by businesses. And also he spoke, he did a lot of consultation with businesses as well, right? So, this 6-year consultation period is really important because it, we can look at these Ruggie principles and say, look, this was accepted not only by countries or human rights NGOs, this was widely accepted by the leading international businesses, because it's true. The international businesses, they were shown Ruggie's drafts. They were given opportunity after opportunity to discuss them with him and to make comments and all this kind of thing. So their attitude is also very much reflected in the Ruggie principles. I'm saying this because, it's important to stress that, this isn't something that lawyers in Geneva and New York just made up and, shoved in the face of businesses. No, international businesses were very much involved in the drafting. So that's always really important to stress. Ruggie has written a book. I think it's called Just Business, if I remember correctly. But if you look him up, then you can find it. He's written a book about this whole 6-year process and how he wrote the principles on the basis of a lot of this kind of consultation. And it's really interesting. I mean, it's quite a interesting story because it also gives you an insight into the UN and how it works. So I definitely recommend it for anybody who's interested. So the UNGPs, again, they make it very clear that we're talking about clear legal standards, the International Bill of Rights, which is really the three core human rights legal documents: the Universal Declaration, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And we don't have time for me to go through them all. Do please look them up. The point is, this is really it. I mean, this is really the sort of body of the main international human rights. And it's just a minimum. I mean, basically, at minimum, businesses should respect these. And the international labor standards, which are adopted by the ILO, and go into very sort of detailed minutiae about working hours and, made the need to make sure that there's safety in the workplace, all these kind of things. So again, these are international laws, international provisions, things which, have been adopted and interpreted by countries and quasi-legal institutions for a long time. The other thing, and this is important to remember, remember what I was talking about with the supply chain, is that Ruggie made it very clear businesses should respect human rights, and they must not be complicit, right? You cannot be complicit in violations. Yes, you don't violate human rights directly, that's obvious. But even when it's about your supply chain, you're responsible. You're not directly responsible, okay, fair enough. But you still have some responsibility because you have a business relationship with this supplier that is violating human rights. You're enabling their human rights violations. So, you have responsibility, and you have a responsibility to try to make sure that those violations don't take place. That's really one of the key things that Ruggie made really clear. So, if you're looking at really big transnational companies now, they won't come up with the kind of excuses that Nike tried in the 90s. They won't come to you and say, ah, but these are suppliers. Yeah, it's not us. I mean, we have, it's not our problem. They won't say that kind of thing because they know they can't anymore. It's just not acceptable for a responsible business to say those kind of things anymore. So that's why, the international, the Ruggie principles, the UNGPs are really important. And, we don't have time to go through the whole thing in detail, but I really do recommend anybody who's interested in, do please try and check them out. I have really sort of quick summaries of what the Ruggie principles say, and so I'll give you those. The Ruggie framework really has 3 pillars, right? So the first pillar on the left here is organizational commitment. Make a human rights policy. And I'll go into a little bit more detail in my next slides, okay? But you make a human rights policy. The human rights policy should be comprehensive. It should cover your suppliers. It should do all this kind of stuff. And there should be an implementation structure. I'll talk about that in the next slide. Due diligence. This is really important. Do your due diligence. If any of you have studied law, then you'll know what this is, right? So before you start a new business relationship, before you start business in a new country, a new context, you do due diligence to make sure that what you're hoping to do doesn't add to any kind of human rights violations, right? You do that before, you do it during, you do it after. So it's an ongoing process that you've got to do. And what's really important is that the risks should be to the rights holders, right? A lot of people, with corporate people, they look at the slide and they hear this and say, yeah, but okay, that's sort of like risk assessment, risk evaluation. Yeah, it's risk evaluation, but it's not the risk to the company. Because if you're thinking about the risks to the company, you will always have an inclination to say, yeah, this looks like a serious violation, but nobody's going to find out, so it'll be fine. Or, yeah, this might be serious, but let's err on the side of starting the business. So, that's what you got to be careful. The third pillar I'm talking about is effective remedy. And this is sort of like a quasi-judicial process that companies should set up to when there is a violation, to right the wrong, basically. The starting point of this is that like there's no country where there are no human rights violations. It's the same thing with companies. There will always be violation, no matter what you do, no matter how hard you try. Something will always happen. So the remedy allows people to file a complaint and file a grievance and make sure that their case is heard and that any kind of rights violation is addressed. Now, to do all this kind of stuff, it's really important that you engage with stakeholders. In business and human rights, we talk a lot about stakeholders because I guess we're dealing with businesses all the time. So we talk about stakeholders, but really in human rights, we want to talk about rights holders, right? The people who have the rights. Yeah, so the workers, their families, the residents of communities where you have operations, all this kind of thing. These are the rights holders. This is what we're talking about. So the first one of the 3 pillars, right, the organizational commitment, is the one about human rights policy. And we don't really have time to go through each and every single one of these in great detail. But if you are, interested in business and human rights, or if you're thinking to work in a particular company, it's really good to look at their website in great depth and try to find out if they have a human rights policy, first and foremost, because, well, most gigantic transnationals do now, but you never know. There are still laggards, companies that haven't managed to do this yet. And this human rights policy really has to be something that goes beyond the usual sort of compliance with national laws kind of thing, right? I mean, it's something which has to be, it has to really be very clear that it talks about international human rights and international labor standards. And if the country where the company is operating has laws which do not meet up to these standards, the company should say in its policy that it will try to do something about it. Yeah, it might be a little bit unreasonable to demand that, the company, completely stop any kind of business relationship with countries where there are human rights problems, because every country has human rights problems. But we want the company to be a positive force. Yeah, we want the company to use their leverage with the national government, and say, look, we want to operate in your country, but with these kind of labor rights violations, which it's very difficult for us to do that. Right, that's what we're looking at, and is the kind of thing that we started seeing in Bangladesh a little bit, some other countries, Cambodia. So it is doable. It's much more realistic than some people might think. Now, there's there's another thing, which is that there should be top level commitment. If you have ever, if you know big organizations, you'll know that having a policy is fine, but somebody's got to be responsible for it. It's got to be somebody's job to make sure things happen. And that can't be, Saul Takahashi, who just joined the company, out of school. No, it cannot be like that. It has to be somebody at the top. Ideally, it should be the CEO, or it can be somebody on the board who really is responsible for implementation of human rights, right? So that's something which is very important and usually very lacking, at least in Japanese companies, for sure. The other thing is that there should be clear mention of suppliers, that the company expects suppliers also to abide by human rights standards. And there should be, it should be quite clear what the company will do when it finds out that its suppliers, a particular supplier has problematic practices. Yeah, no, we're not necessarily asking that the international brand just cut them off, but there should be serious discussions, and there should be like a plan for improvement. There should be perhaps like funds for that improvement to take place. This is the kind of thing that companies are expected to do, right? Human rights due diligence. This is, like I mentioned, something that should be done before and after any kind of operations. And again, it's the risk to human rights. It's not the risk to the company. That's really important. All of this really has to be done with cooperation with rights holders, in particular civil society. So like if some Japanese company wants to, do some kind of big operation in Burundi, what it's got to do at the beginning is contact, of course, the Burundian government, which it would do anyway, but also Burundian NGOs operating in Burundi, international organizations operating in Burundi, ask them, what the concerns are and if there are any potential issues with the kind of business that it wants to do, and make sure that those kind of stakeholders are involved throughout the process. That's really important. Now, one company I'm going to show you, which is actually a pretty good example. This is Coca-Cola. These screenshots are a little bit old, I have to admit. They might, I think they're a couple of years old, but they're still good examples, and Coca-Cola is still a good example. When I'm saying that, I do want to make, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that Coca-Cola has no human rights problems or environment problems. Of course it does. And what you see a lot in business and human rights is that you see that it's the companies that have had major league problems pointed out to them and have been, bashed by NGOs repeatedly in the past, that have at a certain point got their act together. So Coca-Cola, there are still problems. Don't get me wrong. I mean, like no country does not have any human rights problems. A company as big as Coca-Cola, of course, it has problems, but it is widely recognized as one of the companies that is doing, has a serious human rights program and is trying its best to do the right thing. So if you look at, if you look at their website, there's this human and workplace rights, and it talks about the human rights due diligence that it went through, and it has identified these issues as being key throughout its operation, right? So health and safety, child labor, forced labor, especially migrant labor, right? These are the kind of main human rights issues that Coca-Cola faces in a lot of the places it operates. And so we go and we look and see, and you see that it looks at particular issues and how they play out in particular countries where Coca-Cola has operations. I think the example I have is, Brazil. So if you see, there's this long list of countries where there are serious human rights issues and where Coca-Cola has operations in, right? And so the human rights due diligence, that it conducted led to the production of this big report. It's kind of a pretty thick report. 46 pages, right? So it hired people to go to Brazil, check out forced labor, child labor, and land use in the sugarcane industry, and how Coca-Cola can make sure that it doesn't contribute to human rights violations, that it's not a negative force in this issue in Brazil, but it becomes a positive force. And this report is, it has all these recommendations. Coca-Cola has accepted these recommendations. It talks about what it's actually been doing, and all of this is on their website. I mean, that's already saying how open they are about these things. All of this is on their website. This is the kind of human rights due diligence that we've done. So, it is really, it's a good example of the kind of issue-specific due diligence that companies really should be doing. The third pillar, third and final pillar, is the effective remedy. And you remember I mentioned that there's no such thing as 100%. There are always going to be human rights issues with operations of a company, especially a gigantic transnational. So what we're looking at is some kind of process where workers, residents, anybody impacted by that company can file a complaint. And when I talk about a sort of quasi-judicial process, I'm not talking like something like a court, but the person should have the right to be represented. There should be a hearing. It should be something more formal than let's go for lunch with the boss and chat about what's making you unhappy kind of thing. It should be a formal process. And that also helps the company, because the company learns about problems earlier, sooner rather than later. They learn about them, before the problems get out of hand. So it's a really good learning tool also for companies as to where they can improve their human rights performance. And here's another good example of a company that has these kind of a grievance process that is very accessible. It's very important when you're a gigantic company, you have a large supply chain. That means, potentially affected people all over the world. So Heineken, which has it has a business model where it licenses out production to a huge number of companies. Wherever you go in the world, there's a Heineken. I never liked Heineken, but anyway, wherever in the UN, everybody drank Heineken. They go, wherever you go in the world, there are Heineken. But what Heineken has done is, as you see, this is their grievance process homepage. You select where you are, you select the language. I mean, just look at the selection of languages that they offer in which people can file a grievance, in which people can say, my rights have been violated, labor rights, whatever, right? So that's, this is a pretty impressive showing here. Again, Heineken has problems, and Heineken, still, it's not perfect. No company is perfect, just like no country is perfect. But as you can see, they have a very serious grievance process. And here, this is Japanese, I'm sorry about that, but this is an example of, is from the Apple website. And Apple is a company I also use as a good example. Again, not to say that they don't have problems, they definitely have problems, but if you go to their website, there are a lot of pages about labor rights and the things that they are doing to assist suppliers to make sure that there are no human rights violations. So, they see human rights as a branding tool. Now, real purists could say, well, that's not right. I mean, that's, they should do human rights. Human rights should not be a branding opportunity for companies, because then they'll just fake it. And, I'm a purist myself, and I do understand that. But, the fact of the matter is Apple has looked at human rights. They see it as important. They see it as fundamental to their corporate image. So they're going to try to do their best to maintain that image as a human rights respecting company. And that can't be a bad thing. We talk about in human rights, we lobby governments to ratify human rights conventions. And sometimes people say, yeah, but at the beginning they'll ratify it, but they're just going to pretend that they're not going to do anything. And yeah, usually that's the case. But when you ratify a convention, when you say you're signing on to a treaty, that already creates a momentum. And people will start working in the government, assuming that that's part of their job, that's core to what it is that they're going to do. It takes time sometimes, 5 years, 10 years, 20, it takes time sometimes. But the point is, it's going in the right direction. And so, I am a purist, but I don't really agree with that argument. I think it's a good thing. Human rights should be looked upon as a branding thing by companies, because in that way they'll show that they're taking it seriously, that they'll show that they're trying to do the right thing. So yeah, well, in large-scale development projects, we talked a lot about the supply chain and development projects, mainly energy, but development as a whole. This is a whole sort of separate area within business and human rights. And there are also international standards about how the residents of the area, including but not only indigenous peoples, should be consulted on any kind of decision. And this is where we get back to what I was saying before about the importance of making sure that stakeholders, rights holders, are consulted each and every step of the way, and that they are included in the whole decision-making process. And these are just some tips that I often give companies for what good stakeholder engagement should be. It really is something that has to be done together with residents, NGOs, with labor unions, all the kind of people who could potentially be affected by any kind of business operation. And there are good examples. We don't really have time to go through them in great detail, but one example which has been published actually by Shell is of a very long pipeline in the Philippines, and it took them years really to go to all the communities that would be affected, and ask them, show them the business plan and say, how can we make sure that this doesn't have a negative impact on your lives, your livelihoods, your rights, all those kind of things. There were some instances that actually changed the route of the pipeline in some areas in response to concerns. They created funds for employment generation, all this kind of thing. And there were costs that were involved in this engagement, no question, but it was something like a couple of $1 million, which in the broad scheme of this longest pipeline in Southeast Asia is like nothing. I mean, it's absolutely nothing. And they themselves have published the numbers saying that we saved more money by doing this, but because it prevented problems down the line. So that is really important. Here's a bad example from Argentina, but we're going to skip some of this. This is a good example of a Danish paper company that was making paper from the Congo basin, so again, around DRC and some of the countries around there. Some of the innovations that they had for making sure that the whole approach was inclusive is very impressive. It's a really impressive example where they gave handheld monitor. They consulted with the indigenous peoples that were living in the forest, and they were made to understand that some of the trees were considered sacred. So the company said, okay, we're not going to cut down these trees if that's bad news. So we want to make sure we avoid that. But there were no sort of maps or plotting, so they couldn't do it. So what they did is they gave people in the communities handheld GPS monitor type contraptions, and when they approached, these community members would approach some of these sacred trees, they would they would do something on the monitor that plotted that onto a GPS kind of map. And so that would show the Danish company, okay, we can't touch this particular tree. So, again, it's just making sure that it's being inclusive, making sure that concerns are heard, making sure that rights aren't trampled over. That's really what it's about. Now, so in closing, I know I only have a few more minutes, so I'll just try to finish up a little bit quickly. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, which is where I worked for about 5 years. The Business and Human Rights Resource Center, if you Google business human rights, definitely we will come up on the top. That's not because we pay money to Google. We don't. It's just because the Business and Human Rights Resource Center really is the main international NGO in this entire field. And their website is really an amazing database of information that you can access. It's an NGO, so it's completely open to the public. Everything in the website is completely, open and free to access. So do please take a look at it, business-humanrights.org. It has basically what people did as local representatives, national representatives all over the world, is gather information on business and human rights, negative and positive. So, bad human rights violations that companies were involved in, but also positive approaches by businesses as well. So if there was a human rights policy that we felt was particularly innovative and good, sometimes we put that on the database. There is actually the only existing international database of human rights policies. It's not 100% comprehensive, but it's very good. And researchers, business people, governments all over the world use this. Use the website of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, and please, you should too. One of the things that really distinguishes the Business and Human Rights Resource Center from everybody else, really, is that when, like for example, an NGO would write a report on a particular company, we would take that report and we put it on our website. So that gives often a lot of these NGOs were, national NGOs, very local jobs that, they would not have an audience beyond their own country. But by us putting it on our website, we would give them an international audience, which is of course very important because these issues, should receive international attention. But what we would also do, and this is the distinguishing part, is we would contact the company and we would say, look, this NGO has written this report about you. We don't know, we are a completely impartial actor in this, but we're going to put this on our website because that's what we do. That's our job. So we're giving you, company, a chance to provide a response to their allegations, to their findings. If you think they're full of it, then this is your chance, because we will take your response and we will also publish it on our website. So if you go to the website, you can see it's also a database not only of the NGO reports and also the journalist reports and all that, but all these responses from companies. Globally, the response rate was about 75 to 80%. It depends on the year, but 75 to 80%. So that's good. I mean, that's a pretty serious response rate. And it just goes to show how international companies, at least, and national companies too, they took this very seriously. They recognize the importance of providing responses to NGOs when they make allegations, which is one of the reasons that, that's really the main reason that we did it. A company sometimes would refuse to respond, or they wouldn't get back to us, and we would put that on the website. And so that also, we like to believe, leads to strengthening of accountability, because it makes that company look bad. Yeah, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, we contacted, Mitsui Bussan, Mitsui Trading on this particular NGO report. We gave them an opportunity to provide their side of the story. They refused. So they didn't take it seriously. They don't take the opportunity seriously to comment or to respond to NGOs when concerns are raised. And this makes them look bad. That's the fact of it. It's a way of strengthening accountability through naming and shaming. And that's what we do in human rights. We name and shame. That's our job. So it is a very important source and a resource for anybody who's interested in these kind of issues. Already academics are writing articles based on the responses in our database. It was pretty serious. And we had every week on Wednesday, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center publishes the latest news, the weekly report, I think we called it. Maybe they changed the name now, it's called the latest news. And that's sent out as an email every Wednesday morning, London time. So, of course, it's an NGO, registration is free, so you can get that sent to your inbox. Certainly any researcher who's interested in this issue, and a lot of business people too, business people working on this issue in their companies, they subscribe to this and they get it. And it's completely free. So do please go to the website if you're at all interested in business and human rights and check this out, because it is a very important resource. Yeah, this is how you can do it. And it's all, again, it's all free. Don't worry. Nobody's going to ask you for your credit card. So finally, that's my time is up. So I'm just going to sort of advertise some of my books. This is the one I wrote on drug control. This is the one on the right is a big edited volume from a while ago. But this is the most recent one. It's on civil and political rights in Japan. If you, it's extremely expensive. I hope you can use this 30% discount, which is, I hope it's still available. I'm not sure, but it's like so many academic books, it's outrageously expensive. So do please try to use a 30% discount. But if you buy only one book this year, please make sure this is the one. If you're at all interested in Japan or human rights in Japan, please check this out. Okay, great. So thank you very much. That was a bit of a rush, and I'm sorry if it seemed a little bit, rushed and some things weren't clear, but yeah, I hope that helps. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. That was really informative. I thought there was quite a lot that you managed to get in 1 hour. Quick question: if anybody has any questions, you may ask now. Otherwise, we'll break up into groups. There are 20 of us today, so we'll break up into maybe 5 groups. But any questions to start? You can either put up your hand, you can type it, or you can just ask. I'll give everybody another.
Okay, may I ask one question?
Say thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was really interesting content. And I want to ask about that cell phone issue, that the cell phone and rare metals. Recently, I heard that there were movements of ethical cell phones, and then not so many militia groups are now involved, or that's what I heard, but the situation is not so improved, but by your understanding.
Right, thanks. This is one of those issues which actually there's been a lot of attention on. And it has been, in all fairness, over the past number of years, I think it's fair, maybe 10 years or so, there has definitely been improvement, certainly on the part of the large international manufacturers, so like Apple and Samsung and Nokia. There has been quite a lot of improvement. I didn't really have time to talk about this too much, so that's why it sort of came out as very broad brush. But one of the really what the issue is with conflict minerals is that like I mentioned the middleman in my presentation, but quite often it's the smelters being the companies in sort of usually in countries or neighboring countries, or all over the place. Actually, there's smelters in Japan even. But so you get, say you get gold from different areas, some of which are ruled in a legitimate way, some of which are ruled by armed groups, and all the gold comes together, and because they get smelted, they get melted together. And that makes it basically impossible to figure out, where the gold comes from, you see. And what people have been saying on this issue for a number of years is that's really where the issue is. So I think there has been movement towards regulation, some regulation of the smelters, but it hasn't gone that well. I mean, it is moving in that direction. I take that back. It's been moving, but it hasn't been moving as quickly, I think, as some of us would like. But you are right. It's one of those issues that has received a lot of attention, and which I think it's fair to say most of the big manufacturers are on board with, mainly because it's become such a source of bad publicity for them, because a lot of the whole conflict mineral issue has become pretty well known, and there are there's the US has legislation which is significantly weakened by Donald Trump, but there's legislation, the EU was making legislation on it. So, there are loopholes in the legislation that's not perfect, but the point is that there was bad publicity, and the big companies realized, look, We got to do something about this. So, you know, even also when I meet Japanese electrical companies, even if it's about something else, one of the first things they'll always talk about is, oh yeah, but you know, we're doing all of this on the conflict minerals. We take it really seriously, and look at what we're doing, and blah, blah, blah. So definitely it's an issue on which there's been progress. The ethical, in Japan, there is, perhaps you're familiar with it, there's an organization called Eshikaru Keitai. If you, ethical mobile phones, if you look it up.
Yes, but not many people know about this issue in Japan.
Well, Japan, yeah, of course, it's not as well known in Japan as it is in a number of other countries. I can't say it's, you know, I can't say if I stopped somebody in the UK, if I stopped people on the street, would everybody know about it? Of course not. But yeah, it's still a little bit more known, I guess, for example, in European countries than it would be in Japan. But there is an organization in Japan, and if you can look it up, they do have some, like, companies or organizations. I remember there's an organization in the Netherlands that was making sort of like fair trade phones, if you like. And some of these phones they could guarantee that they were at least 90% sourced properly. But there was always something like 10% or 5% that they just couldn't account for. And again, that's because of the smelters and because of the loopholes in the regulation that exists. So, you know, but there are these, those things are available. I'm not sure that they managed to make it available in Japan. There was some kind of problem with it, but it can be purchased in some European countries. And there is, like you say, there has been movement in the right direction, but it is still going on. I mean, you know, DRC is still going on. The armed groups are still there, and, you know, they're still fighting over a lot of these areas. So there has been progress, but, you know, a lot still needs to be done, I think.
Okay, thank you very much.
Saul?
Yeah.
Sorry, just talking about, I think it was called Fair Phone, and I cheated and I looked up. I knew about it.
Yeah, Fair Phone, that's it,
yeah.
yeah.
So, but it's so when you start playing fair, you have to you're not cutting corners, and you put prices up, and your supply chain gets really expensive. Things so a lot of them don't succeed, you know, and you can't compete with these Chinese firms, like cutting, you know, many corners and not treating people fairly, you know. So what do you think about it? And, you know, and it's a reason why things are cheap, I think, because people, consumers, we want to buy things as cheap as we can, right?
Yeah.
As possible. And so I don't think people really care about that. They just care about the cost.
Well, I mean, I think, of course, a lot of people only care about the cost, but I don't, you know, the opinion surveys on these kind of issues show that a lot of people actually do quite care about these kind of things, and they would be willing to pay a little bit more.
What I was saying, also, sorry, so the thing is that people can't afford to pay any more than they're actually paying. And that's the big issue, I think.
It's one of the big issues, yeah.
Right, so it's a race to the bottom, if you like, you see?
It's one of the big issues from the consumer's point of view, but I'm not sure it's the only issue. Like if it's a choice between, you know, buying 10 Uniqlo polo shirts versus, you know, 6 that I could be confident of were sourced properly, that you know, there are people, I mean, that's shown by the surveys. A lot of people actually would go for the option that's, yes, on the surface it's more expensive, but that they could feel better about. I mean, I'm not belittling, or not belittling, that is not really what I wanted to say, but I'm not arguing against, you know, I think one of the cores of what you're saying, which is that, you know, people now are so desperate that they don't have, you know, that their disposable income is going down, so they don't really have the space to think about it. That's, you know, I completely understand that. But I also think that might be almost like a separate issue in some ways. I mean, and that's the thing, you know, because companies are always, you know, we being human rights activists, we always go to them and they say, yeah, but, you know, consumers don't really want this, you know, consumers don't really care. We only provide stuff that the consumers want. But, you know, our answer to that is, well, how do you really know that they wouldn't, you know, that they wouldn't buy an ethically sourced option? Yes, maybe a little bit more expensive, but you're just assuming, this is me talking to the company, you know, you're assuming that given these two options side by side, the people would not go for the cheap, would not go for the more expensive one. And
well, Saul, if you go to Starbucks
mm-hmm.
and you want to get some ethically sourced, like free, like fair trade coffee, for example, right? So it's always far more expensive. There's only like a tiny percentage of their, it's minimal, right? So it's all about, and I think they promote that, but it's all about image, I think. So it's all about their corporate image, I think. Right.
Well,
and saying we do this and this, but you look at the percentages are tiny. It's not even, it's ridiculously tiny. So I don't think they're really making an effort, in my opinion.
Well, that could be. I mean, you know, I'm not such a fan of Starbucks for different reasons, but
No.
it's that could be. But, you know, again, we get back also to what I said at the beginning, which is, you know, this is something that they're supposed to do. It's not something that they should, you know, that they, you know, might want to consider because it makes them more money. You know, I mean, and this is I actually wanted to ask everybody this, I guess through the Google Classroom thing, but this is one of the debates that people have actually in this whole business and human rights arena, which is that how can we, you know, because there are a lot of us human rights people who say we need to show, you know, how can we show businesses that it's good for them, that it's worth their while to respect human rights. And, you know, you have differing views on this. I mean, it's, you know, I've come to my personal conclusion, which is that I don't think it's even worth trying, because it's never going to happen that we convince them of that. We're getting in there. If we start using their framework, well, it makes you more money, then we've already accepted the premise that, well, this is optional, right? My argument, you know, when we go to governments, we don't say it's optional. Of course, governments are, you know, they have a clear legal obligation, whereas companies is more a responsibility. But it's, you know, we don't say, oh, well, you can ratify if you want. We say, look, you better do it. You have to do it. So, you know, in my mind, with companies, it should be the same. But, you know, there are differing opinions on this kind of thing and differing ideas or strategies of how to go about this. What I can say from experience is that convincing companies that respecting human rights will always lead to more money is very, very difficult. It's probably impossible, frankly. Oh, I see.
There.
Yeah,
there's lots of questions coming.
Yeah, there's things coming in chat. What should I?
There are.
NPR.
Okay, thank you, Zane. Yeah, so that's. Okay, there's Bernadette is actually a Burundi student, one of the star students from Burundi.
All right.
She said, talking about human rights in business, how is the position of PWDs back in Japan in facilitation of doing business? And how can other countries cope with international human rights to integrate PWDs into business?
Sorry, what are PWDs? I'm sorry if this is a dumb question.
My next question, Bernadette, what are
Oh, I'm glad you're making me feel good. I'm glad I wasn't the only one.
PWD meaning here.
But I just
Public Works Department.
I don't think so. But just the earlier argument though, I mean, there's probably, it's hard to quantify, but I imagine there are correlations between, you know, knowledge, in other words, people learning about human rights and how much your shirt, you know, damages and so on, and how things do become, you know, there are tipping points. Otherwise, we just sort of capitulate and say, well, what the heck? I mean, you know, whatever. Yeah. I want that.
Exactly.
I don't give a damn who died for it. It's my shirt. I want that.
Yeah.
And that's the attitude that I think that we need to sort of be weary of. And I think that the more that, you know, and I like to be a little bit optimistic and say that, well, you know, once we start to learn more, we do become a little more socially responsible. That's just kind of a whole, again, you can't quantify. I mean, maybe you can, but I can't imagine.
Yes, in Japan, there is so little information on such thing like, you know, ethical keitai. There are a lot of, you know, media exposure of child labor in Africa, but not, you know, mountain gorillas or, you know, people dying of those, you know, conflicts. There's almost none of such, you know, media exposure. So I think there should be more. Yeah.
But
then
Kenko-san, that's
people
by
may
design.
change.
That is by design, I'm afraid. So.
Yeah, I would tend to agree.
That's by design, so yes.
But yeah, but I agree. I mean, it's for sure. It's important that people know about these things. People have to, know more about these things. So everybody should come to Osaka Jogakuin, and everybody should learn about all these things all the time. So that's what should happen.
Bernadette, you may speak anytime if you can. Hi, can you hear us?
All right. By PWDs, I meant people with disabilities.
Okay, all right. So why, being a human rights guy, why did I not get that one? Okay, so persons with disabilities. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, look at other countries. The persons with human rights position of disabilities back in Japan. Well, so you're asking how good is the record of Japanese businesses in ensuring PWD, the rights of PWD? Yeah, is what you're asking.
Yes.
Well, yeah, I mean, the short answer is it's not good. You probably know, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities requires that countries, and so by extension, through countries, that countries require companies to make sure that PWDs, persons with disabilities, are included and mainstreamed throughout economic activity and basically any kind of sort of walk of life. Now, Japanese companies, there are legal provisions, I think they're requiring, if not, I'm not sure that they're required, but they're strongly encouraged for sure, to hire a certain percentage of their employees have to be persons with disabilities. So if you just look at the law, that's like, well, that's great, that's fantastic. And it's not bad. But how Japanese companies do this is they create like a special, they create like a special company, a special part of their company, which is sort of way over by in the alleyway, and they do hire persons with disabilities, but they're given basically very menial jobs, and so they sort of shove them to the side and just sort of let them do their thing, and they don't really care about them. Yes, they're hiring them, they're providing them with employment, but it's not really what UN standards require or are looking for. So they actually have been criticized by, there are of course NGOs, and I think I'm not sure if we've ever been before the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, but I know that there's been a lot of criticism for them on that. A lot of companies are finally, I'm talking about Japan, are really sort of getting on board with the whole business and human rights agenda in Japan. And that's really been because of the Olympics. Now the Olympics, we didn't do them. I'm not even sure we're going to do them next year. We might never do them at all. And I hope we don't do them. But at least, even if, yeah, I mean, the point is, this has already, spurred this kind of discussion. And it's led to a lot of the kind of stuff about diversity that I was talking about. So there's more thought of how persons with disabilities can be hired, the mainstream in the workforce, and there is more serious talk about human rights, due diligence, and policies, and all that kind of thing. So, that was a bit of a long answer, but the point is really that there's a lot of stuff to be done in Japan for sure, but at least companies now with the Olympics and everything are realizing that they have to do something about this issue. So, let's see. Let's see better. Yeah, international spotlight in labor laws in Qatar, run up to 2000. Yeah, that's exactly. It's exactly the same. And the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, if you go to our website, there was a section on mega sporting events. And there's a different organization, a different NGO, also in London, few stops, a couple of tube stops away. They were the Institute for Human Rights in Business, and they have a very strong mega sports program, and sort of advocating to governments and businesses how they can improve their human rights record using the spotlight of mega sporting events. But definitely, the the whole thing with the Olympics, I mean, it's been a game changer in many different ways here in Japan. And, you know, that's a good thing. I mean, I'm personally against the Olympics. I think we just throw, you know, to the toilet, but, or at least I'm saying, you know, we shouldn't hold them here in Japan. That's definitely not in the summer. But, you know, the point is, for sure, from the point perspective of the business and human rights agenda, it definitely has worked. I mean, it's working in the sense that it's moving, it's advancing things in the right direction. So that's, you know, that's important. And if nothing else, that legacy of mega sporting events is a positive one, I think.
Great. Okay. She's one of our star students, by the way, Takahashi Sensei in Burundi. So yeah, she's been helpful.
Great. Awesome.
Good. Okay.
I hope to be able to come and meet you guys in person someday, inshallah.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, we got to get rid of this Corona thing. We got to get rid of this Corona thing first. We can't travel anywhere. I'm going crazy.
Yeah. Actually, we're coming in December. We have a graduation day.
Oh, okay. Well, let's see, inshallah.
Like, so one last question, if I'm allowed to ask. Do you think, because in Burundi, what I have analyzed is that for us, I have a disability. So from my experience, I analyzed that when we go to for an interview, or when we go to ask for a job, they always look for, I mean, even though you are brilliant, I have realized that in Burundi, we are not yet to that level where a person is related to physical ability. So it's important to have people with disability being imported into business, and then develop the mindset, and also break out this mindset of people who think that a person is judged by a thing I got for an interview, and they judge me for my physical.
We can let her play music, but change it.
Bernadette, yeah, I think you're sort of cutting in and out, so I'm not sure I really understood.
I thought it was gender equality. I wasn't quite sure, but yeah, we've had this issue with East Africa with the
Sure. Yeah, no, of course. I mean, the connections. Yeah, I mean, it's look anywhere.
Send an email later, Saul. Would that be okay? Or
yeah, sure. Of course, that's fine.
Okay. Anybody else have any other questions, comments? We're going to finish up soon. I don't think we'll have time much for breakout rooms and group discussions. So if anybody has anything they want to talk about, please let us know. Any other questions? Otherwise, I could do a quick. Zane, should we do a quick breakout room, or is there time?
I don't think there's time because we only got like literally
six. Because the questions are so so interactive. So that's fine too. Okay, well.
Saul, thanks very much for your informative talk.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. It was very, very enjoyable.